I'd like to introduce you to a principle that I call value stacking. And I define value stacking as a means by which you can maximize impact by unbundling the problems and rebundling the solutions. And so over the next 20 minutes, let's unpack what that means together. And I'm going to start really, I want to first go through my struggles as a PM, as a PM leader. And it really starts with this question of what's the next best opportunity? Like, where do I focus? How do I drive growth? How do I trade the long term versus the short term? And how do I find that diamond in the rough? And actually, when I find it, how do I persuade people that this is where we place our bets? So, in other words, like, how do I articulate the rationale? And, I have this mix of raw data and hard data when I have to put forward some kind of case. And this is, quant, qual, and this raw data often manifests itself as a gut feeling. And so kind of this product journey often looks like this for me, and maybe you can relate. I have a set of opportunities that comes in all shapes and sizes. And I try and find somewhere to start. And so I might start somewhere here, for example. And then I pick on this particular opportunity and I try and size it up, right? So I pick a particular framework, whatever the framework of the month is, right? So here I might have to think about these attributes of impact and effort. And really, this is what I'm really trying to generate is some kind of return on investment. And so I do that by taking, I generate a score that is a function of this criteria. And then I'm able to now apply this same technique across all the opportunities, which is great because now I'm able to size them up and compare. And now that I have a score, which is effectively some kind of pseudo ROI, I'm able to stack rank them, right? So I can really start picking out the opportunities that I focus on, which is great. And then something happens. Now I start picking an item that might be that might fall outside of my typical budget. And now I need to pick on finance. And it turns out finance isn't going to give me $1 million because I have the number 15 attached to my opportunity. So I need to put a business case together, right? So, in my case here, this is a SaaS business. So I look at certain attributes here to generate some form of revenue impact over a cycle of time, say 3 years. What's the payback? What's the ROI? So I've got hard numbers behind this. And that's fine. And now we get to what I think is the fun part, which is really bringing this to market and driving growth. Right? That's ultimately what we're trying to do here is solve customer problems and unlock growth for the business. And so what happens at a certain point in the journey of the business, right? Especially early on, we're actually quite happy because we've been able to deliver what I think of as this fast growth, right? We wanted growth over the next quarter or so. We delivered that growth. Maybe it's a little higher than we expected. Maybe it's a bit lower, but we've delivered some growth, right? And so over time, whether it's via external or internal factors, there's some kind of perception change, right? Because this fast growth is great. This linear growth is great until we may get to this inflection point, whether it's in the market or internally, where we perceive that we can actually get high growth, right? So until that crossover point, we were all about fast growth because especially if you're a startup, right? You just want to hit your next quarter, right? It's all about fast growth. But at a certain point, you see there's an opportunity to have very high growth. And the steps that lead to fast growth are quite different to the ones that lead to high growth. And so we see this kind of change of perception over time. And you might think about your company, where you are in this cycle. Like, what are you really focused on? And there's no right or wrong here, right? And so I kind of model it like this, right? That's how I think about it. Imagine you have a set of opportunities here. And these opportunities as a collection, they deliver a certain value. Let's call it arbitrarily this value of 15. And now we have another set of opportunities, which are, you can see they're worth slightly less than the ones above. And of course, if you add these together, this is going to be worth less. Makes complete sense, right? So I think with this kind of blue line thinking, it's clear that we invest in the top set of opportunities because it has what do we have here? 25% extra value. So we invest in the top opportunities. Now, what if we could actually work on a sort of opportunities that actually compound on each other and multiply value, right? That changes the equation entirely. Because now what we're talking about is something, even though individually they're worth less, this has 4x the value. Now, granted, this is a rather abstract example. So let's take a real world example. And I'm going to choose Apple. And so with Apple, I recall the journey with Apple in the introduction of a number of their product lines. But if I take the iPhone in particular, in 2012, I think it was, they introduced this app. They released this app that allowed you to collect loyalty cards all in one place, right? And they called this app Passbook. It wasn't a flag feature, and it almost went unnoticed when they announced it, actually, in 2012, I recall. But they released that in 2012. The following year, they then released Touch ID, which really helped them go from like passcode access to instant access, right? You could instantly get into your phone, right? Clearly very popular, highly used, and smartphone usage went up easily 3x, right? In terms of how often people unlocked it. And then the following year, in 2014, they made their killer move and they introduced Apple Pay, right? And they really leveraged this NFC, this near field communication technology, to launch Apple Pay. And so now mobile payments is accessible to everyone, right? And it was a hit. And it actually still continues to snowball even today. Now, when I think about it, when I reflect on this, I was trying to unpack, like, how do they get here? Because just the biz dev alone for Apple Pay would have taken, I estimate, 2.5 to 3 years, right? Negotiating with MasterCard, Visa, Amex, all the banks, all the cards, at least in the US. That's, even for Apple, that's not a small piece of work, right? So they knew they were going to launch Apple Pay, I would say, at least 3 years ahead of time. So what were they thinking? And so this is my contention. They introduced this app called Passbook. And it turns out Passbook wasn't just about loyalty cards. It was about, you could have a boarding pass for your plane. Actually, that's how I started getting to use it. You can have cinema tickets. You could have concerts or events that you could go to, scan it in. And of course, they renamed this 2 years later. This same app, they renamed it Wallet. So what they did is they introduced a card habit. So for 2 years, they were instilling a card habit. So you kept adding cards, right? It was quite easy then to say, oh, do you want to add credit cards as well? Easily done, right? So what looked like a low grade feature, quite frankly, turns out was a very key feature, right? Because turns out when you want to pay for things, you need a wallet for it, right? Why not introduce that and unpack that value early on? And then they introduced, of course, Touch ID. And here, of course, you got this fast access, but you actually got very secure access. So by the introduction of biometrics, they removed the trade-off of, is it easy to use? Is it super secure? Before Touch ID, honestly, those were mutually exclusive things, right? You can't expect to have both. Well, that changed overnight with Touch ID. So they introduced a secure auth habit. You were able to authenticate instantly, right? Again, can you imagine paying without authenticating who you are? And then finally, they introduced this near field communication, and they introduced a pay habit. And that pay habit was made incredibly easy because the two other habits were well formed by that stage. So yeah, they value stacked their way to the pay habit. And if I quote Steve Jobs, he talks about, you can really only connect these dots when you look backwards. And I think of these dots like not as solutions, but actually as problems. And so how do we go about doing this ourselves? So one of the first questions I ask myself is, what's the problem behind the problem? Right. Sometimes you see a surface problem and there are layers and layers of problems that are often behind it. Or I might think, actually, I have a collection of problems. And as I look at these problems, maybe there's a meta problem that actually sits above all of this. Right. So I ask myself, like, what might be the meta problem? And so understanding the relationship between these problems is really clear. You may have this kind of these matryoshka Russian dolls, right? How are these, what are the layers of the problems? How are these problems connected to each other? Understanding that relationship is really key, because then you can unlock whole new solutions, right? Because you might have this problem of keep me dry, give me shelter, have a nice view. These are independent problems, right? But turns out, as we start bringing this together, there's a bigger problem we're solving for, which is like, I just want a home, right? So understand what the bigger problem is. If I take an example from Pipedrive, because Apple was almost an unfair example, right? They own every layer of the stack. So what have we done at Pipedrive? So at Pipedrive, we actually launched this chatbot, right, that allowed you to automate getting leads from your website. And that worked nicely, right? We had this feature out. Some people went for it, some people didn't. And then we followed this up actually with the ability to have live chat. So we complemented the chat experience with live chat. So you can now seamlessly switch between the two when we were trying to handle more bespoke sales queries. And then we actually covered the ability to get outbound leads, right? So even if you didn't get much traffic on your website, our customers were able to filter across hundreds and millions of leads. And we did this. So kind of what we did here is we allowed you to automate leads from your site. We allowed you to handle all the leads from your site. And eventually we allowed the ability to have outbound leads. And we did this sequence because we were solving for a bigger problem, actually. So that problem was, how can we get you more leads? In fact, how can we get you leads on tap without being a marketing expert of sorts? What if we could just get you leads on tap? And that's what the team focused on, right? Every single problem they're solving for is really focused on this bigger problem. And sometimes, just like the Russian dolls, you don't know when these problems end, right? There's a problem we are unlocking at the moment as we speak, which is sits above this. Like, why are you trying to get more leads? Actually, maybe it's to get more deals, right? Some more opportunities, so you can grow revenue. Why are you trying to grow revenue? So you can hit your revenue targets. And so that's actually the bigger problem we're solving for here, right? So sometimes you're removing more and more layers here to the problem. So what would planning look like here? Now, the first thing I would say is it's worth spending time to align on your product portfolio allocation as product leaders. And so you're not just product people. We're investors. So what percentage do we want to allocate to, for example, high growth? Right. Think about this as a portfolio. What percentage you want to allocate to fast growth? Maybe as a startup, it's 100%. That's fine. That makes a lot of sense, right? And maybe you have other buckets as well. Maybe there's a bucket for incubation, some kind of new ideas that are not well formed, and you want to kind of research and undergo discovery. So think about the portfolio and how you invest. Also, think about how you plan back from the problem or problems, right? If you understand the meta problem, how do you plan backwards from the problem, right? And you do that by traveling forward in time, right? So you think about the big meta problem. And this is quite an intuitive process, actually, because you want to do this simultaneously whilst iterating forwards from the solution, right? And so we live in this world of agile. It's like iterate, 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 iterate. Iterate to what? What are you moving forward to? What's the big problem you're trying to solve for? So you want to think about these things concurrently, right? And then you start moving to a world where you're value stacking, right? Because you know the end state, you know the end problem you're solving for. But actually, as the environment changes, as the market changes, maybe the problems change, because as you're solving for getting a home, maybe post-pandemic, people are looking for different solutions, right? Maybe they're looking for not just a place that they can rest. Maybe they're looking for a place they can work, rest, and play. So that problem changes, and therefore the solution you need to think about might change. So let's reflect on this to conclude. So first, think about your product portfolio allocation. Look and find the meta problems, right? You might be unearthing more and more problems there. Look for the multipliers. What are the opportunities when brought together actually multiply on themselves? So look beyond additives. Look for multipliers if you're after the high growth. And then plan backwards from the problem and iterate forwards to your solution. And then you're in the world of value stacking. So let's revisit the definition. Value stacking, as I stated, you want to maximize the impact to drive growth by unbundling the problems, which you work backwards from, and rebundling the solutions, which you iterate forwards from. So I end with, what are you going to value stack?